He owned nothing. He could go nowhere without permission. He could be sold, separated, punished, at the decision of another human being. And yet, by the time he died, students were traveling from across the Roman Empire to sit at his feet, not because he had power, not because he had wealth, not because he had freedom, in any form the world around him recognized, but because he had identified something about the human mind that free people, people with every advantage he lacked, had completely failed to see. He noticed that most people, despite living in complete physical freedom, had voluntarily surrendered the one thing that actually mattered. And the strangest part? They had no idea they had done it. Epictetus was born into slavery, somewhere around 50 AD, in what is now Western Turkey. His name, in Greek, means simply, acquired, a possession, a thing that was bought. He was brought to Rome as a slave, eventually owned by a man named Epictetus, a secretary to the Emperor Nero, who, according to some accounts, once twisted Epictetus's leg to test whether he would show pain. Epictetus looked at him calmly and said, "You are going to break it." When it broke, he said, "Did I not tell you?" Whether the story is literally true matters less than what it reveals about the philosophy he would spend his life building. Because Epictetus was not performing stoicism. He was not suppressing pain behind a mask of discipline. He had arrived at something far more radical, the recognition that the leg, the body, the physical circumstances of his existence were never the things that defined him. In his discourses, a collection of his teachings, recorded by his student Arian, Epictetus introduced what would become one of the most quietly devastating frameworks in the history of human thought. He called it the dichotomy of control. Some things are within our power. Some things are not. Within our power, our judgments, our desires, our responses, the way we interpret what happens to us. Outside our power, our bodies, our reputation, our circumstances, what other people think, say, feel, or do. That distinction sounds simple, clean, even. But follow it carefully, and it becomes one of the most uncomfortable mirrors you will ever hold up to the way you actually live. Part 1. The prison most people never see. There is a particular kind of suffering that has no external cause. No one has hurt you. Nothing has gone wrong. And yet the mind is restless, running conversations that haven't happened, rehearsing outcomes that may never arrive, carrying the weight of opinions held by people who are not in the room. Epictetus would have recognized this immediately. He spent decades watching free people, people with resources, status, autonomy, living in a state of chronic agitation that his own enslaved existence had forced him to examine and ultimately transcend. His observation was precise. Most people do not suffer because of what happens to them. They suffer because of what they believe. They are owed by what happens to them. The promotion that didn't come. The recognition that wasn't given. The relationship that didn't develop into what they imagined it should be. None of these things caused the suffering directly. What caused the suffering was the gap between expectation and reality. And expectations, Epictetus argued, are entirely within human control. Psychologist Martin Seligman, in his landmark research on learned helplessness, found that the most psychologically damaging experiences are not those where people face genuine adversity, but those where people believe that what happens to them is outside their ability to influence. Epictetus arrived at the same conclusion, from the opposite direction, not by studying what happens when people lose control, but by being a person who had no control to lose, and discovering that the interior life remained entirely his own. The question he would ask you, and it is worth sitting with honestly, is this: how much of your suffering today is caused by actual events? And how much is caused by the story you are telling yourself about what those events mean? Most people never separate those two things, which means most people spend their lives fighting battles that exist entirely inside their own interpretation of reality. But that is only the surface of what Epictetus observed, because the dichotomy of control does not just explain suffering, it explains something far more specific and far more difficult to admit about the relationship between your mind and the people around you. Part 2. How you give your mind away. Think about the last time someone's opinion of you changed how you felt about yourself. A comment that landed harder than it should have. A look that stayed with you longer than made sense. An absence of praise that felt, in some way you couldn't quite justify, like a verdict. Epictetus would not have been surprised. He believed that most people, without realizing it, without being asked, without any external force requiring it, continuously hand the keys to their inner world, to other people, not to enemies, not to people who wish them harm, to colleagues, to strangers, to people whose opinions they will never change, and whose judgment they will never fully escape, because they have made that judgment structurally necessary to their own sense of worth. He wrote in the Enchiridion, his condensed manual of Stoic practice, that it is impossible for a person to be harmed by someone else's words or actions. They can only be harmed by their own response to those words and actions. That claim sounds, at first, like a form of denial. But psychologist Albert Bandura's research on self-efficacy, the belief in one's own capacity to influence outcomes, found that the single most significant predictor of psychological resilience is not the absence of adversity, it is the degree to which a person believes their response to adversity is within their own agency. Epictetus did not have the vocabulary of modern psychology, but he was describing the same mechanism. The difference between a person who experiences an insult as information about themselves, and a person who experiences it as information about the person delivering it. One of those people has given control of their inner world to whoever happens to be speaking. The other has kept it. The disturbing implication, the one most people resist, is that this is always a choice. Not always an easy one, not always a conscious one, but a choice. And the people who have never examined it are making it constantly, in favor of everyone around them, without ever noticing the transaction is occurring. Part 3, the role you play without knowing it. Epictetus used a metaphor that has stayed with philosophers for 2,000 years. He said life is like a play. You did not choose the role assigned to you. You did not choose the length of the performance. You did not write the circumstances into which you were born, but how you play the role, with what quality of attention, with what integrity, with what degree of presence, that is entirely yours. The modern mind resists this metaphor, because it sounds like resignation, like an instruction to accept what cannot be changed, and call that acceptance wisdom. But that is a misreading. Epictetus was not asking people to be passive. He was making a more specific argument, that the energy most people spend trying to control what cannot be controlled, other people's perceptions, external outcomes, the pace at which the world delivers what they believe they deserve, is energy borrowed from the interior life that actually can be shaped. Psychologist Roy Baumeister, in his research on ego depletion and the limits of self-regulation, found that the capacity for self-directed behavior is a finite resource, and that it is depleted by exactly the kind of struggle Epictetus was describing. Every hour spent managing what other people think of you is an hour not spent deciding what you think of yourself. Every unit of psychological energy directed outward, toward controlling outcomes that were never within your power, is unavailable for the interior work that actually determines the quality of your experience. Epictetus lived this argument completely. A man who could not control where he slept, what he ate, who owned him, directing every available unit of his attention toward the one domain that remained entirely under his authority, his mind. And the uncomfortable question his life poses to everyone who has more freedom than he ever did is what, exactly, you are doing with yours. Part 4, the subtle ways control is surrendered. The dramatic surrenders of self-control are obvious. The person who abandons their values under social pressure, the person who changes their position the moment someone pushes back, the person who becomes a different version of themselves, depending on who is in the room. These are visible. They are easy to recognize in others, and uncomfortable to recognize in yourself. But Epictetus was more interested in the subtle surrenders, the ones that happen so quietly, so continuously, that they feel like personality rather than choice. The constant checking, not just of messages, but of whether the world is still responding to you the way you need it to. The mental rehearsal of conversations that haven't happened yet, preparing arguments, anticipating criticism, constructing responses to judgments that exist, so far, only in your own imagination. The reluctance to commit to a position until you have read the room, gauging not what you actually believe, but what belief will be most safely received. None of these behaviors feel like surrender. They feel like intelligence, like social awareness, like the reasonable navigation of a world full of other people, whose opinions have real consequences. And sometimes they are. But Epictetus would ask you to examine where the line is between genuinely useful social calibration and the habitual, automatic, barely conscious outsourcing of your own psychological stability to the reactions of people around you. Because once that outsourcing becomes habitual, it stops feeling like a choice. It starts feeling like reality, and the person living inside that reality has, in the most practical sense, given up the only freedom that Epictetus believed was ever truly available. Part 5. What freedom actually looks like. Epictetus did not describe freedom as the absence of constraint. He had no access to that kind of freedom, and he knew it. He described freedom as the presence of something more interior, a quality of relationship with your own mind that external circumstances cannot reliably produce or destroy. The practical version of this is not detachment. It is not the performance of not caring. It is the development of what he called the examined response. The gap, however brief, between what happens to you and what you decide it means. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived 4 Nazi concentration camps and wrote about the experience in man's search for meaning, described finding the same gap in the most extreme conditions imaginable. He wrote that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies human freedom. Frankl did not cite Epictetus, but he was describing the same discovery, made independently, 2,000 years later, under conditions that make most modern suffering difficult to contextualize. The space Frankl described is not something you either have or don't. It is something that grows with deliberate practice, specifically the practice of noticing before you react. What category a thing belongs to? Is this within my control? Or am I about to spend a significant portion of my psychological life on something that was never mine to determine? That question, asked honestly, does not produce passivity. It produces precision, the ability to direct energy toward what can actually be changed, and to release, without drama, what cannot. Epictetus spent his entire life practicing that precision, under conditions most people will never come close to experiencing. The question his life poses is not whether you could do the same. It is whether you are willing to try it with the far more abundant freedom you already have. Epictetus was eventually freed. The historical record is unclear on exactly when or how, but by the time he began teaching, he was no longer legally owned by anyone. He moved to Nicopolis, on the northwest coast of Greece, opened a school, and spent the rest of his life teaching the philosophy he had developed inside his captivity. He lived simply. A wooden bed, a mat, a lamp. When the lamp was stolen, he replaced it with a clay one. He said the thief had done him a favor, removed something he had been more attached to than was wise. That response, calm, unsentimental, almost amused, is either the behavior of a man who had genuinely internalized what he spent his life teaching, or it is the most disciplined performance in the history of philosophy. Either way, the question it leaves behind is the same one his entire life asked. You have more than a clay lamp. You have time, attention, energy, the capacity to direct your mind toward whatever you decide matters. Most of that capacity is currently allocated to things you cannot control, to outcomes, opinions, and futures that exist, for now, only as possibilities you have decided to suffer over in advance. Epictetus had nothing, and he kept his mind. The question is not whether you can do the same. The question is whether you have noticed that you are already giving it away. Cognilux. We don't motivate. We clarify. Subscribe before someone uses this on you.